All right, let's uncork the story of the 21st Amendment. And look, this isn't just about ending prohibition. This is a much bigger story. It's about the only time in U.S. history that a constitutional amendment has ever been repealed. And that one act, it completely changed the game, creating this huge power shift between the federal government and the states. A shift that, believe it or not, we're still dealing with today. So, let's get into it.
So, what's the only amendment ever to be repealed? Yep, you guessed it, the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. But here's the thing. Its replacement, the 21st, wasn't just some simple undo button. No way. It basically set up a whole new constitutional game with brand new rules that affect everything. I mean, everything from your local liquor store all the way up to major Supreme Court cases. It's a really fascinating piece of American legal history.
So, first things first, we've got to understand why the whole country did a complete 180 on this. The 18th Amendment, it was called the Noble Experiment. But let me tell you, by the early 1930s, it was pretty clear to just about everyone that this noble experiment had gone terribly, spectacularly wrong.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to this quote. Now, this isn't from some gangster or a regular person who just wanted a drink. No, this is John D. Rockefeller Jr., a guy who was not only a super wealthy industrialist, but also a lifelong teetotaler. I mean, the man didn't drink, and he'd been one of Prohibition's biggest supporters. So when even its most powerful, most unlikely backers were publicly admitting defeat, well, the tide had absolutely turned.
Yeah. Instead of creating this more moral society they'd hoped for, Prohibition basically created a national nightmare. It was like pouring gasoline on the fire of organized crime, turning guys like Al Capone into household names. It kicked off a huge, often violent black market. Corruption? It was everywhere, totally rampant. And maybe the worst part was this growing disrespect for the law itself. And if that wasn't enough, remember, the Great Depression was raging. The government was broke and losing out on millions upon millions in alcohol tax revenue it desperately needed.
So what happens when public opinion shifts that dramatically? Well, the whole issue moves out of the back alley speakeasies and straight to the ballot box. Suddenly, repeal wasn't just talk, it became the central political battle, and it forced politicians and entire parties to finally pick a side.
And that brings us to the 1932 election, which really became a national referendum on prohibition. You had two very different approaches. The Republicans, under President Hoover, they were kind of waffling, offering this complicated compromise, sort of a soft revision. But the Democrats, led by FDR, they were crystal clear. They campaigned on one simple idea: complete and total repeal. It's pretty obvious which message resonated with the American people.
And after Roosevelt's landslide victory, things moved at absolute lightning speed. I mean, check this out. A huge wave of pro-repeal or wet candidates swept into office in November of '32. Just 3 months later, Congress passes the Blaine Act, which officially proposes the 21st Amendment. And by December of that same year, it was ratified and became the law of the land. We're talking about a complete political revolution in just over a year.
Okay, but getting Congress to pass the amendment was really only half the battle. They still had to get 3/4 of the states to actually ratify it. And to pull that off, supporters used this incredibly clever and totally unprecedented strategy to get around a massive political roadblock.
So you might be wondering, why get so creative? I mean, why not just send it to the state legislatures, like every other amendment before it? Well, the answer comes down to some very tricky political realities of the time.
The solution they landed on was to use something called state ratifying conventions. Now, this is one of two ways to ratify an amendment that's actually written into the Constitution. But get this, it had never been used before. The idea was, instead of having state lawmakers vote on it, the people themselves would elect a special group of delegates. And these delegates had one job, and one job only, to vote yes or no on the 21st Amendment.
And here is the absolute genius of the plan. See, the temperance lobby, all those pro-prohibition groups, they were still incredibly powerful and really well organized at the state level. A lot of state politicians were, frankly, terrified to vote against them because they were scared it would cost them their jobs. So this convention system, it took the decision completely out of their hands and gave it directly to the voters. It was a brilliant move that basically neutralized the temperance lobby's political power in one fell swoop.
And think about this, the 21st Amendment is still the one and only amendment ever to be ratified this way. It's this incredible historical footnote, but it was absolutely essential to making it happen. Honestly, without this clever strategy, repeal might have failed.
Okay, so Prohibition is over. Story's done, right? Not so fast. The the story doesn't end there, because the 21st Amendment didn't just repeal the 18th. It included a little something extra, a second section. Just a short, 28-word sentence that completely rewired the constitutional relationship between the states and the federal government, but only when it comes to alcohol.
So let's break it down. Section 1 is super simple and direct. The 18th Amendment is gone. Poof. Done. But then you get to Section 2, the twist. It says, the transportation or importation into any state of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited. Now, that might sound pretty straightforward, but what it actually did was hand an enormous amount of power directly to the states to control alcohol however they wanted.
And look, don't just take my word for how big a deal this was. The courts themselves have recognized just how unique this is. This quote from a federal court case spells it out perfectly. Section 2 is the only time the Constitution explicitly grants a power directly to the states. It basically created this special, one-of-a-kind exception for a single product, alcohol.
So this unique grant of power, it wasn't the end of the story at all. In fact, it was the beginning of a brand new one. You could say the shadow of Prohibition's repeal hangs over nearly a century of legal fights, creating this constant constitutional tug-of-war that is still being fought in the courts even today. And this set up a major constitutional conflict. It's like a heavyweight legal battle. In one corner, you've got Section 2 of the 21st Amendment, which seems to give states total, absolute control over alcohol inside their borders. But in the other corner, you have the Commerce Clause, a foundational part of the Constitution that gives the federal government the power to regulate business that crosses state lines, to create one big national market. So, what happens when a state's alcohol law bumps up against that national market? Who wins?
Well, the Supreme Court has spent decades trying to referee that fight, and what they've basically said is that states can't use the 21st Amendment as an excuse for what's called economic protectionism, which is just a fancy way of saying they can't create laws just to help their own local businesses and hurt out-of-state ones. For instance, in a big case called Granholm v. Heald, the court said a state can't let its own wineries ship directly to customers while blocking out-of-state wineries from doing the same. And more recently, in a case called Tennessee Wine, they struck down a law that said you had to live in the state for 2 years just to get a license to sell liquor. So the big takeaway here is pretty clear. Yes, states have a lot of power over alcohol, but that power is not absolute.
So, when you look back at all this, what's the ultimate legacy of Prohibition? Well, experts are still debating it. On one hand, you have thinkers like Robert P. George, who see it as a noble experiment. It was well-intentioned, worth a shot, but it just failed because of the huge social costs like crime and corruption. So repealing it was the smart thing to do. But then you have others like David A.J. Richards, who see it very differently. They argue it was an unjust law from the very beginning, driven by some pretty ugly motives, and that the real tragedy is we haven't learned our lesson, that we're just repeating the same mistakes today with a modern war on drugs.
And that really brings us full circle. The repeal of Prohibition didn't just solve a problem. In a way, it created a new and much longer-lasting question. The street battles over bootleg liquor are long gone, but the constitutional battle that repeal kicked off, that struggle to find the right balance between a state's power to control alcohol and the need for a single national marketplace, that is a debate that is still very, very much alive today. And it's a question we're all still trying to figure out.